I've been working here at the church for almost 10 years, and I help with the youth group, and I've helped with music before and helped with missions. I help with a lot of things, but right now I'm in seminary, and I'm learning how to try and be a pastor, and so that's why I get to be here with you today. They're letting me preach a little bit, and so I appreciate you having me here, but I actually have a feeling that more of you, instead of know me, you might know my daughter. She's the little angel baby. Emerson, she's the one that gets passed around at lunch afterwards and just smiles and giggles all the time. And so I get to be Emmy's dad, and that's all you need to know about me now. But I've been at the church here for almost 10 years on staff. And one of the things that I've always enjoyed about here at Grace is that we get to wrestle with some real things that really matter to life. We don't leave things up here. We go, God cares a lot about our day-to-day life. And so one of the things that struck me a couple years ago, Pastor Chris took us through a series of the book of Job. And if you guys know the story of Job, the guy who had the worst day ever, right? And I say that kind of funny, but it's true. I mean, Job was a good man, and he followed the Lord, and he was a man of integrity. And then one day, there's these robbers that come and take all of his animals. And the same day that he's just lost all of his livelihood, an earthquake knocks over his house, and his kids are all inside, and they all pass away. And then the same day that he loses all of his livelihood and he loses his whole family, he also gets really sick. And so Job is sitting there in this worst day ever. And Pastor Chris was taking us through, what does the wisdom of the book of Job explain to us about God? And I was so taken by this idea. I think this is 2 years ago that when I started seminary, I ended up writing a paper on this passage. And today I wanted to explore it even a little bit deeper with you. And so today we're going to be in the book of Job, chapter 38. And if you want to follow along, you can, but I'm going to be reading a lot for you. And to kind of set this up again, Job has just been spending this day trying to find out what is going on. Why has this happened to him? And he's been asking his friends, and he's been asking his wife, and everyone's got their own opinions for what went wrong and why Job has experienced this utter grief and loss. And none of those answers make sense to Job. And so finally he just cries out to God. He's, God, you'd better come down here and answer me yourself. And so that's the part of the story that we pick up with. But before we get there, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a person that loves learning. Anyone else love learning? Like you just love learning new things. Or you love learning old things. Or you love learning things that you're never going to use in your life. You just like to learn. I'm one of those people. And when I was growing up, the thing that I heard the most from my parents, the thing they said to me more than any other thing was, Drew, you don't need to know everything. Because I was that kid that would always ask why. Did you have kids like that? Anyone have kids that always asked why? Well, why this? And then you give them the answer. Oh, okay, but why this? But then you give them the answer. Okay, well, why this? But why this part of it? But why this part of it? Drew, you don't need to know everything. Well, why don't I need to know everything? It was just, I'm sure I drove my parents crazy, and my wife has since told me that in God's justice, I'm going to have a daughter that does the same thing to me. And it might happen, but you know what? I don't know. We'll see when we get there. But I was the person that always wanted to know why. And so I have an affinity with this part of the story that we're about to read, okay? So can we read together? This is Job chapter 38. And I'm going to start in verse 1. I'm going to read a bunch of verses here. This is God showing up and answering Job like he said he was going to. It says, Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm. He said, Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footing set? Or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness? When I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place? When I said, this far you may come and no farther. Here is where your proud waves halt. Have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place, that it might take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked out of it? The earth takes shape like clay under a seal. Its features stand out like those of a garment. The wicked are denied their light. Their upraised arm is broken. Have you ever journeyed to the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been shown to you? Have you seen the gates of the shadow of death? Have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Tell me if you know all this. Like, we need to take a break after that, right? Because I know that it's easy for us to read into this and kind of give some intonation for God. And it might seem like Job has just spent all his time going, why, God? And then God shows up going, sit down and be quiet, right? Like, it seems like that, right? God has just shown up. And I don't think that's what's happening here. And I'm going to tell you why. But it's really easy to go, whoa, we need to take a break. See, the thing that we need to understand about Job is that Job is sitting in this place of overwhelm and crushing grief, where nothing in his life makes sense and everything is called into question. I wonder, have you ever felt that before? Maybe it's when the doctor came back into the room with that grim look on his face and said that one word that you didn't want to hear. Or maybe it's when those notices from the bank keep showing up with the word foreclosure. Or maybe the boss breaks the news with that hollow phrase, I'm sorry, but. Or that family member that you've been trying so hard to reach out to just angrily walks out of your life. I mean, maybe it's been something different for you, but all of us have experienced those times in our life where nothing is right, everything is wrong, and our heads and our hearts can't get together, and we just can't understand what to do. And this is where Job is. All he wants is an answer. Why? Why did I lose everything I own? Why did I lose my children? Why have I lost my health? And everyone he talks to seems to have their own opinions, but none of those answers make sense because he knows in his heart he didn't deserve any of this. Why? Why, God? And God gives him an answer, but it's not the one that we expect. Right? We read this. It seems pretty harsh. See, the way that God answers Job's question is with his presence. He says, I'm going to draw near to you. I'm coming to where you are, Job. And if you think that I'm not doing a very good job of running the world or running your life, well then, okay, we can talk about that. If you think you could do it better, let's go see what this is going to entail. And then, what does he do? As soon as we started reading, God just took Job on this field trip. He says, you know what? Do you even know how much I care for you? Do you even know how much I care for the whole world? Were you there when I formed the world out of swirling dust? Do you know how to put exactly enough mass into it and to make the orbit the exact distance for light and life to exist? Were you there when all the angels and the fish and every star, when I finished speaking creation to existence and every atom sang for joy, were you there? And then he starts shifting. He talks about the sea. Do you remember the part where he starts talking about like setting limits for the sea? And we were like, why did he just start talking about the sea? He's talking about the universe and now he's talking about the sea. But you have to understand, in that day and age, the sea was terrifying. Like, if you've ever been out in a boat far enough to where you don't see land anymore, you know what we're talking about. Oh, my goodness, I am tiny and this is huge and I don't know what's down there. And so the sea had come to represent the idea of darkness and evil and terror. That's where they thought the gates of hell were. And so God starts talking about the sea when really he's talking about evil and terror. And he says, do you know how to control evil? Have you set limits on the sea? Because I have told its proud waves where to halt. Have you ever held on to the leash of that big snarling beast you think is down there? Do you think that you can judge all the wicked? He starts talking about the earth. He says, remember he's talking about the wicked being denied their light and their upraised arm broken. Because again, the understanding was in the dark is where evil happens. And so at night is when bad people are out there. You ever walked in a weird place at night and you're like, oh my goodness, I do not like this. Get me to where the light is. Same thing for Job. Is that whole time. And God starts saying, do you know how to stop evil by telling the dawn when to show up? Do you know where to lead the sun at the end of the day so that darkness can come back? You don't even know where the sun is. You don't even know how light works, but light overcomes evil. It creates depth and texture and color, and you don't even know how it works. I mean, come on. Job, you've lived so long, you've got to be knowing what I'm talking about here, right? I mean, maybe God wasn't snarky like that. I like to think he was, but maybe he wasn't. The point is that God is asking Job a bunch of questions to which each of the answers is no, right? Like the only answer that Job can give is no, I wasn't there. No, I can't. But God, you were there. God, you can. See, God is trying to give Job perspective. He's not trying to shame Job into silence. He's connecting with Job and he's bringing him into a higher perspective so that he can gain some new understanding and knowledge. And this is the part where I go, yeah, come on, give us the knowledge. I want to figure this out. Why? And us humans, we love collecting knowledge, right? We love to understand why. See, the first humans that went after knowledge that should have been left for God ended up becoming ashamed of themselves and each other, and they hid from God in a garden. We remember this story, right? Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, and it was too much for them to handle. Here again, God is giving Job a taste of knowledge, and it's almost too much for him to handle. And here's how Job responds. See, we just read the first couple verses of chapter 38. God goes on for 2 chapters. And so finally in chapter 40, Job responds. And he says, this is verse 4. I'm unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. See, God has just said, what do you think of all this, Job? And Job is rendered speechless. I mean, it seems like Job is starting to get a realization, maybe God knows more than me. But he's not yet ready to change his stance. He's not yet ready to fully trust God. He knows God is carrying everything, but he's not quite yet ready to say, I trust you, God, with everything in my life, even this darkness that I don't think I deserve. Trust is hard, right? Trust is hard because to really trust, you have to not know or not fully understand. And we don't like that. We want to know why. We want to understand something. We want to be able to decide whether or not it's fair according to our standards, right? Like that's the whole point, that we want to know why so that then we can decide if it's good enough or not. And that's what Job is doing, saying, I don't think this is good for this to have happened to me. Explain it to me so I can decide whether or not you're right, God. But God isn't inviting Job to judge for him. God is drawing near. He's drawing near to us, and he's inviting us to still trust him based on his character. Because so far, Job has recognized God is God and he is not. But he's not in a place to still just blindly trust God with how his life has turned out. There's still some questions he has. And maybe you've asked these questions yourself. You've gone, yeah, I get that you're good, God, but how can I reconcile that with the suffering that I see? Because it's all well and good to believe in a good God who creates a good world, but what about this world? Where there's pain and injustice and hurt, where good people have bad things happen to them and bad people seem to be fine. What about our world? This good world that we have that's touched by darkness and death, is that still under a good God? See, God answers that question too. Right after Job responds and says, yeah, I know you're God, but I'm not ready to trust you yet. God responds, this is chapter 40, verse 8. God says, would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? Do you have an arm like God's, and can your voice thunder like his? Then adorn yourself with glory and splendor. Clothe yourself in honor and majesty. Unleash the fury of your wrath. Look at every proud man and bring him low. Look at every proud person and humble him. Crush the wicked where they stand. Bury them in all the dust together. Shroud their faces in the grave. Then I myself will admit to you that your own right hand can save you. God is saying, excuse me, are you like God? Because if you're able to adorn yourself with majesty and glorify your own name and smite all of your enemies with the flick of your wrist, well then yeah, you're right, Job. We are the same. Therefore, sure, give me advice on how I should run the world. See, God is asking some more questions to Job, where the answer again is, no, you're right. I can't do that, God. But you can. He's again trying to give him some perspective, but then God doesn't stop there. If you keep reading in chapter 40, all of a sudden God shifts and he starts talking about these huge creatures. One is called the behemoth, and one is called the Leviathan. And there's been all kinds of people who've spent lots of time trying to figure out, are these real animals? Are these ancestors of animals we have? Are these dinosaurs? And we could get lost in that. But see, the reason that Job, the book of Job, is grouped together with the wisdom literature in the Old Testament is that we're not supposed to be caught up in names and dates. We're supposed to recognize the truth of the wisdom that God is trying to explain to us from the story. And so here, all we have to understand about the behemoth and Leviathan is maybe they were real animals, but in the culture of the time, those names had come to represent archetypes of land monster that cannot be tamed and sea monster that cannot be caught. They're really representing danger and chaos. And God is talking about them being proud of how powerful they are, being proud that they are part of his creation. I created them, Job. You can't catch them, but I can. You don't know where they sleep, but I do. I know everything about them, and they are beautiful. What he's saying is danger and chaos have a part in God's creation. This makes me stop because that might be a beautiful thought, but then it makes you wonder, well, if danger and chaos are part of creation, does that mean that that's what God uses to punish people who are bad? And I don't think so. That's not the case here. They're not instruments of God's punishment, and it also doesn't mean that God has walked away from creation and just let stuff go. See, God has created and continues to create an increasingly complex world that's not designed to prevent suffering. And before researching this sermon, I hadn't really thought about that the world isn't designed to prevent suffering. Like, think of like something beautiful like a rose, and yet it has thorns. And I don't think that that's because sin entered the world that roses have thorns. I just think that's how roses are made. The fact that they're sharp is just part of the rose. See, the world is good, but it's not like perfect according to my opinion. The world is ordered, but it's also dangerous. The world is sometimes chaotic, but it's also beautiful. And it's wild. I mean, think about it this way. We don't ask questions about the justice of gravity. Have you ever thought about that? Like, we don't go to some place and go, wait, gravity makes things fall down over here too? That's not fair. Like, that's just how gravity works. No matter how much I want to fly, this is how gravity works. And I don't think that that's because of God's injustice. And so, at the same time, why do we question the justice of whether rain falls in one place and not another? Why is God not bringing rain? Well, that's just how the ecosystem works. That's not God's justice. He created this beautiful world, and it works the way it works. And in the same way, we don't get mad that when you fall out of a tree and land on your arm wrong and your bone breaks, you go, God's injustice. My bone broke when I fell on it wrong. That's what bones do when you fall on them wrong. Like, that's just like, I would love it if my bone never broke in my whole life, but that's what happens. So why do we have the same kind of railing against God when there's diabetes or heart disease in some person and not the other? And we go, that's God's wrath. I don't think so. See, and we don't like to think of these hard questions because we would love it if we could just judge whether or not the world is just according to our judgments. Like, I would love to be in charge of my opinion as to whether or not something should happen or not. And throughout the whole book of Job, the Lord is asking us to stop trying to simplify him and fitting him into our own box. We can't judge the way that God made the world. Job couldn't judge the way that God was running the universe. But God's also telling us not to accuse him of what he's doing based on our limited perspective. It's way too easy to judge God based on my own judgments. Have you ever had that thought? If I were God, I would do it differently. No one would die, except for the bad people and the ones that annoy me. Like, that's not going to work. If we were God, it would just be up to us again. See, we need bigger perspective. We need to be brought up. But see, we're never going to get to the same level of where God is in order to be able to tell him how to do his job. We can't get there. God is way higher than we are. But that doesn't mean that we're not allowed to vent. It doesn't mean that we're not allowed to doubt. God carries the whole universe, and he can absolutely carry our unanswered questions. What God is doing through this story and through our lives is he's inviting us to trust his wisdom of how he created the world by holding on to his character. See, God is inviting us to trust his wisdom by holding on to his character. And you might be thinking, well, that's all well and good, but you might still be feeling where Job was the first time you're responding, where you go, yeah, I know that God is God, but there's still a few things that don't quite add up. There's still a few things that are keeping me from fully trusting God and his wisdom with the evil that I see in the world. And maybe you read that part. I mean, let's just go back to chapter 38. It's the first thing we read. Remember, we read that part of where, like, it talks about how evil has a place and God can set the limits of it this far or no farther. Then you go, okay, well, that makes it seem like God is in control of evil. And then there's the part where the wicked are denied their light and their upraised arm is broken. It's like, okay, that sounds like maybe God is going to put an end to evil someday. And you might be thinking, wait, if God is so in control of evil and can put a stop to it, why doesn't he already? Why does he let evil run loose? And if we're really honest, we might even wonder, can God control evil? I mean, sure, it says that evil's part of his creation. He set limits for it, but how can we be sure? How can we know for sure that it's under the control of God? And it's at the end of that section that we read where God starts talking about the gates of hell. God actually answers that. I'm going to read it for you again. This is verse 16 in chapter 38. He says, have you journeyed to the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been shown to you? Have you seen the gates of the shadow of death? And he starts talking about the gates of Hades. And we're like, that doesn't answer the question for hell. But see, Job didn't know it yet. But we do know. There is a man who has been to the gates of Hades and has come back. So the author of Hebrews talks about this wisdom of God is only God's wisdom, because the world would think it's foolish that Jesus used the power of death to defeat death. God's answer to Job's question and to our question of why is there evil in the world? His answer is his presence. He draws near. He meticulously shows us how he cares for the whole universe. And then he sent his son to remind us that we are the pinnacle of his creation, worth dying for. Why? Why would he leave heaven for us? Why would he endure mocking and beating for us? Why would he pray for the forgiveness of those who crucified him? He does all this to show us his character. To show us that even when we don't understand, we can trust him. We can trust that he will be with us. We're not alone. He's still good. He is still God. And I don't know if you are in a season of suffering or blessing right now, but all of us can be reminded how to lean on God, to lean on his character, to know that no matter what's happening in my life, I know who God is because of what he has done, to lay our trust at his feet. And we get to respond like Job does. At the end of the book, chapter 42, Job finally gets it. He says, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. We can trust God because he has shown us what his character is. He is still good. He is still God. And he promises to be with us. Can I pray for us? Jesus, we thank you that you have shown us the character of God. You've shown us your character and how you have come for us. And no matter what is happening in our life, the ups or the downs, we pray that you will help us hold on to your character. In your holy and precious name, amen.